Hello, my darlings. Today we are going to cover lesson 511. It's called ecological or ecological. You can say it either way. Succession. Ecological succession occurs when ecosystems change over time through the progressive replacement of species. So again, ecological succession occurs when ecosystems change over time through the progressive replacement of species. It's a gradual change in species composition. You can see it right here. Ecological succession is a gradual change in the kinds of species, right, that live in an ecosystem. Typically, when you have an ecosystem cleared out, and there's nothing there but bare ground, if you leave it alone, you'll start to see some low-growing plants grow, like lichens and moss, and then some larger grasses will start to grow, and then some shrubs and bushes will start, and then over time you'll eventually get some saplings and then some larger trees. All along the way, as you know, the grasses turn into larger plants, which then support shrubs and bushes, which then support trees. All along the way, of course, you'll have all the species of animals that can be supported in that type of environment as well. There are two types of ecological succession. One is called primary and the second is called secondary. Primary succession occurs on bare land. Secondary succession occurs in a disturbed ecosystem, and we're going to go through both kinds. So primary succession begins with bare land, meaning no life, nothing lived there before. Examples of places where no life has been would be a receding glacier or even a lava field. You can see here, this is a picture right out of your lesson. It says, as glaciers retreat, they leave bare rock surfaces that are devoid of plant life. Primary succession occurs as a series of organisms moves in to colonate the land. So those first species that move in to colonate or live on that bare land, those are called pioneer species. And typically your pioneer species are going to be lichen and moss. Lichen is that kind of green stuff that you see on tree trunks. Sometimes if you're walking through the woods, that's called lichen. And you'll also see mosses start to grow. And usually what'll happen is it'll start in those cracks of the land, right? As weather wears down maybe the lava field or the mountain from underneath the glacier, it'll start to create, smaller and smaller particles of dirt, and those dirt will fill in the soil in the cracks, and then seeds will land in the cracks, seeds that were carried on the wind, and they might even start to grow and colonize the land. So like I said earlier, pioneer species are those first types of plants that are going to come into an ecosystem or bare land and start to colonize that bare land. And you can see here a picture of a bare lava field. And then you can see over time, if the bare lava field is left alone, you'll see lichen start to grow on the lava field. You can see the lichen in this area here. Here's a closer picture of the lichen growing on the lava rock, and you can also see mosses start to grow on the lava rock. So those are your pioneer species. Those are those first species that come in to colonize and begin the process of succession. So like I said, during primary succession, the first signs of life occur typically with the germination of low-growing plants. Primary succession always begins with bare land, and slow changes over periods of time allow more organisms to move into the area. So once the lichen and the moss move in, then you'll start to see some grasses grow, and then shrubs and bushes, and then trees, and eventually you'll reach, a beautiful ecosystem supporting all kinds of plant and animal life. Secondary succession is the other type of succession, ecological succession, and it occurs when one community of organisms replaces another. Secondary succession can only occur after an ecosystem is already in place. So if you're starting with bare land and then you grow up an ecosystem, that is considered primary succession. Secondary succession occurs where there was once an ecosystem already in place. That ecosystem could have been destroyed by an extreme event like a forest fire. It could have been cleared for farming. And so if you take that land that had once been viable, an ecosystem was already in place, and leave it alone, you'll start to see the grasses grow, and then the shrubs and the bushes, and then the trees, and of course all the animals that will live in those areas that those shrubs and trees can support will come and live there. If that land was already viable and for whatever reason it just got destroyed, if you leave it alone, secondary succession will take place. Old abandoned farm ground can go through secondary succession. Forest fires will clear out an ecosystem, and if you leave it alone, you'll see green start to come back into the forest that was destroyed by the forest fire. And then another really cool thing I want you to draw your attention to is pond succession. Ponds can be an example of secondary succession as well. So I'm going to go into lesson 511, and I'm going to go to page 8, and I'll bring that up on the screen here, hopefully. See if I can get that to come up. All right, so let's see. Oh, I lied. Maybe it's not page 8. Where'd it go? There it is, page 7. Okay, so I'm in lesson 511, and I'm on page 7, and you can see here it says the disappearance of a pond is an example of secondary succession. Attracted to the clear water of an inland pond, birds unknowingly bring in seed-containing droppings that one day will lead to changes in this aquatic habitat. As seeds arrive by wind or animal, they begin to take root at the edge and in the bottom of the pond. Over time, the plants encroach from the outside toward the center and from the bottom toward the surface. This encroachment slowly transforms the pond into a marsh. As succession continues, the marsh eventually transforms to soil-filled land. While this process may take hundreds of years, it's an example of secondary succession because new organisms are replacing others within the same area. Notice it said new organisms are replacing others within the same area. That's the definition of succession. Explore this example of secondary succession. So I click on pond succession, and it says here natural ponds are formed as streams and rivers change their course, as beavers construct dams, and as glaciers recede, leaving behind pools of water. Over time, secondary succession occurs in the pond ecosystem. Here you will study succession in an abandoned Rocky Mountain beaver pond. So this is just an example of secondary succession. The organisms present in and around the pond slowly affect the ecosystem, and changes occur. Wind, birds, and sometimes humans bring seeds to the pond. Fast-growing bushes such as willows establish themselves along the banks. Aquatic grasses grow in the sediment on the bottom of the pond. As organisms in the pond and along the shore die, organic matter is added to the bottom of the pond. Slowly, that sediment begins to fill the pond. As the sediment continues to build up on the bottom of the pond, slow-growing hardwood trees compete for space and light on the banks of the pond. Lily pads spread out on the surface of the pond and shade the aquatic grasses below. Secondary succession occurs as one group of organisms replaces another. Succession continues as dead plant material is continually added to the pond sediment. As hardwood evergreens begin to dominate rich soils on the bank of the pond, they outcompete bushes and shrubs for sunlight. As the pond continues to fill in, succession continues. The aquatic ecosystem is slowly replaced by a terrestrial ecosystem. The process continues as the habitat changes. As abiotic factors change, a succession of biotic communities dominates the ecosystem. Eventually, the climax community is established. If abiotic and biotic factors in the ecosystem do not change, the climax community remains stable over time. The change that occurs in a pond is a classic example of secondary succession. Now, what's really fun is if we go all the way back, and we click through the slides fast or quickly, we click through quickly, you can see the succession of the pond over time. And then of course we reach that climax community. So if I click through my lesson 511, we get to page 10, and this is a description of a climax community, right? Climax community is a stable, long-lasting community that results from succession. Eventually, after many years, often decades, the ecosystem will reach a point of maturity. The process of succession is complete when a final balance of organisms exists. At this point, no further changes to the balance of organisms should occur. The final state is called the climax community. The species of plants in this community are called the climax vegetation. Ecosystems do have a limit in terms of resources and space with regard to the types and quantity of life that can be supported. The length of time required to reestablish the climax community depends on the ecosystem. The climax community for each ecosystem on the planet is different.